Okay, so we have the walls. Now it's time to build some buildings in our little city. Hello, this is Harold Halfdan and welcome to Archaeological Minecraft. I'm a former archaeologist who enjoys playing Minecraft and thought it would be fun to combine the two. In today's episode, we're back on the Archaeo SMP server and we're continuing our work on the Bronze Age Hittite city. In case you missed it from part 1, the Hittites were a contemporary great power, the likes of ancient Egypt, Assyria, or the Babylonians, but was a civilization that once it fell to the Sea Peoples in the Bronze Age collapse, nearly vanished from the pages of history. Now, in part 1, we talked through the history of the Hittite civilization, from its foundations through its decline and fall, and while building the city walls of our little Hittite city, we also talked through the architecture of those city walls and through the different types of gates that would exist in those cities. In this episode, we're building out some of the building types, such as domestic dwellings used by the city inhabitants, a building that archaeologists think might have been the home of the captain of the guards, a Hittite temple, a granary, and we'll also talk about the roads and plumbing systems in Hittite cities. Before we jump right into the episode and start building out these structures, I did want to correct something from the previous part 1 video. In that video, I was pronouncing the Hittite capital as Hattusa, but it was pointed out to me since that video, it should be more accurately pronounced Hattusha. So I wanted to correct that for this video. Okay, with that out of the way, sit back and relax, and I hope you enjoy the episode. The first structure I'm going to build here is a group of domestic dwellings, and with these small housing complexes, think of them like mini apartment buildings that were excavated from Hattusha. These structures appear to have been fairly standardized in their design and architecture. Here's an example I'm popping up on screen of the archaeological excavations. You can see in this picture that there are 2 of these apartment groupings with 4 apartments in each, as well as a half grouping with only 2 apartments, and these were dwellings that were generally single-story structures. In the central area was a hearth as well as an opening in the ceiling that acted as a chimney of sorts. These chimneys would have had a wooden covering that was able to be shut, or I imagine partially shut, over the opening, likely to block out the rain or precipitation from entering the house through the roof. There was also a wooden ladder to access the roof, with roofs either being flat or perhaps domed in some cases to allow smoke to better rise to a single spot in the ceiling before exiting out through that chimney-like hole. Based on the artifacts found in the apartments, there is some speculation that some of these might have been used as barracks for soldiers based on the weapons contained within them. If they were used as standardized barracks for soldiers, then perhaps the individuals living in each small complex comprise some sort of military unit structure. That's completely my guess. I don't know if there's any evidence to that or not, but that's what logically makes sense in my own head. Like what was discussed when I talked about the Hittite city walls in part 1, the foundations of these structures were made of stone and the walls were made from mud brick covered with plaster. So just like the city walls, I've carried that same Minecraft block palette from the walls over to these buildings I'm creating within this little city. One thing that the Hittites thought about when they were creating these domestic structures were where the windows would go and how the light from those windows would light up the interior spaces of those structures. This seems obvious and perhaps is, but I bring this up specifically because it was a point made by an interesting article that I uncovered in my research, which looked into where windows were placed in walls versus where the floor plan was, and the direction of the light from where the sun would be shining through to show how light would penetrate into the structure. So I just thought it was pretty cool to show how some clever archaeological analysis can shed light, literally maybe, into what people were prioritizing in their architectural design. The archaeology shows that the windows were likely covered with wood or some sort of cloth or textile covering. Remember, this is the Bronze Age, so glass for windows isn't a thing yet. So I tried to replicate what that might have looked like in my Minecraft reconstruction here by putting the trapdoors over the windows. These dwellings also would have been constructed with an eye towards energy efficiency, though they likely wouldn't have thought about it like that. By constructing their structures out of thick mud brick walls, it was able to keep the heat from the hearths in and keep the cold out, while at the same time in hot, dry summers keeping the houses cooler, which effectively acted as if the houses were underground to an extent, and being thick mud brick, I suppose it was underground in a manner of speaking. The floor plan was also designed so that it was divided into a combination of both smaller rooms and larger rooms, which allowed some smaller rooms to stay warmer or cooler, perhaps allowing to be able to store some items in a more climatized space, or perhaps making it more temperature comfortable for the inhabitants. One of the more interesting domestic dwellings that was found and excavated in Hattusha is this structure I'm reconstructing here now, which was a larger dwelling and was likely an official building instead of a dwelling that was owned by a specific individual. This building had more than 20 rooms, and as you can see from the floor plan, some of which were not very large, and from a Minecraft perspective, were quite small indeed. This building was found in Upper Hattusha and is thought to be the home to the commander of the palace guards. One thing that's interesting about this official's home is that there were religious cult vessels found within it, which means that religious practices didn't simply occur within the temples, but was also something that happened in some people's homes. Also within this home were 2 ovens found in central rooms, and like was mentioned above, the smoke from those ovens would have gone up to the ceiling and then out through roof holes instead of having a fireplace and chimney structure against the wall. The other thing that was interesting about the Hittite dwellings excavated at Hattusha is that while they didn't have running water for a water supply, likely people collected their water from centralized fountains, cisterns, or wells, but they did have an interconnected and built-in plumbing supply that would take away wastewater. This plumbing was in the form of terracotta pipes that ran under the houses and then ran into the roadways about a meter under the road. I'll make sure that I show that when I build and talk more about the city streets later in the episode, but I wanted to mention it now, is who doesn't like Bronze Age era plumbing? I mean, that's so cool, 1700 to 1200 BC. The next building I want to talk about and build is this Hittite temple. While the 2 domestic dwellings that I built, I tried to stick to the scale and dimensions of some actual homes and apartments excavated at Hattusha, but with this temple, it isn't an exact replica, but rather a temple that I mocked up to show the typical architectural design structures and layout of most Hittite temples. At Hattusha, there have been at least 29 individual temples uncovered during excavations. The largest temple discovered was to the sun goddess Arena, which was 76 by 73 meters, or 250 by 240 feet, so quite a bit bigger than the temple I'm building here. And it wasn't the only large temple. For example, the Great Temple, which despite its name wasn't the largest, but still large, and measured 65 by 42 meters, or 213 by 138 feet, and it had potentially 2 holy chambers within it of 2 different deities. But it's called the Great Temple not just because of its size, but because it was made from finer and higher quality materials than was used to make other temples. For example, the flooring in the holy chambers and some of the other areas in that temple was a polished dark green stone, and then other flooring materials was a smooth and well-cut limestone, which also, as I'll show in a moment as I build the roadways, continued out into the streets around the Great Temple. From a typical architectural layout perspective, Hittite temples followed a similar floor plan, where the central core area was a rectangle, with the entrance being designed like a gatehouse of sorts, with 2 or sometimes 3 entry doors, which led into a central courtyard. That courtyard was flanked on one or sometimes both sides by columns. Large windows were present that would let light into the courtyard, and that would be the area for common people to be able to access. Continuing around that core rectangular shape, the courtyard led to an antechamber, which allowed access into the holy area where the statue of the deity was placed. This holy area would only be accessible by high religious officials or priests, royalty, or perhaps nobility, but not the common citizens, thus the purpose of the antechamber, to help keep that deliberate separation. The Hittite deities resembled people and so needed food, clothing, and houses to live, which was the core function of the temple. As such, around the temple over time and as needed were constructed different rooms around that core area to store items for the temple and prepare food, which was used to sacrifice to the deity and for religious practices and festivals. So that's what all of these surrounding rooms and bump outs are for around that core rectangular structure. Many cuneiform texts were found within the temples, and so we know that they would act as places of learning and for keeping of records. Along those same lines, temples acted as schools and places of education, no doubt to train scribes and train people in music. Another thing I found interesting is that some of the more affluent domestic structures that were excavated also contained some cuneiform texts, which has led some to the conclusion that perhaps those were the dwellings of priests or other religious officials. As it relates to the religious pantheon of the Hittites, that changed over time with some deities raising or lowering in prominence over the different eras of Hittite history. The Hittites, as they encountered new cultures and religious deities, tended to simply absorb those new gods into their pantheon instead of trying to make paired associations between deities. So this is what I mean by that. So for example, if they ran into a different, let's say, sun deity, instead of just matching that to their existing sun deity, as if the two cultures had two different names for the same deity, they instead added it into their pantheon, and then their pantheon would just have two sun deities. Okay, so I want to take a moment here and talk a bit about my Minecraft color palette with this temple. So you can see that in this reconstruction, I continued the stone and cobblestone foundations here in the temple in the same way as I did with the other Hittite structures I'm recreating. But for the mud brick walls, instead of using mud brick, brown mushroom blocks, and packed mud, I instead went with a lighter palette with these whiter mushroom blocks and bone blocks. I did that to make this temple stand out a bit more, perhaps replicating what might have been higher end or more expensive materials. I also put some paintings on the walls as recreations of frescoes, and then in the holy area I put this prismarine blocks where perhaps the statue would go. And I did that because in Hattusha, there's actually a green block, and I'll pop that up on screen here, that's been uncovered. And it isn't quite clear what that green block was for. And some have theorized that that was the base of what a statue would stand on. So that's kind of what I copied there. And then in another area, another storage area, I put another green block. Maybe that was being stored there. I also used mangrove wood to give the roof a pop of red against the white walls instead of the jungle wood I used in the other builds, which blends more into the color palette used there. So given all that, beyond the flooring material I talked about earlier when mentioning the Great Temple, and where I used the dark prismarine and the smooth stone, and then also the prismarine for the base of the statue, the rest of all this is really kind of my conjecture, as all we have of these Hittite temples is their foundation, some of the flooring, and then that one example of a green stone. I don't know in reality what the color of their roofs really were, or if the mud bricks were plastered over with white plaster or more tan plaster, but to my mind, I think that it makes sense to have the temple stand out more from the other buildings, since the archaeology does show that in some cases higher end materials were used, and then the architectural design shows that temples were designed as spaces that it would have been separate and apart from other common use buildings through the gatehouse and the antechamber design. So that's why I chose the block palette that I did there. Okay, so moving off talking about the temple, and earlier in the video I said that I would touch later on the roads and the streets, so let me do that now. Hittite roadways between cities doesn't seem to have been very extensive, but the streets within the city seems to have been covered with gravel and paved stones. And as I mentioned earlier, there are terracotta pipes under some of the streets to carry away wastewater, which is pretty astounding as we're talking about the Bronze Age here from around 1700 to 1200 BC. There were still plenty of modern cities that didn't have the ability to take away wastewater like that until very recently in many parts of the world. So it really is pretty incredible that we're talking Bronze Age here and have that functionality. So there isn't much really more to say about roads, but just to point out that as I've mentioned earlier that around some of the temples, the roads had better finished limestone. And so I changed up the road material here around my temple reconstruction to reflect that different material. I also built a water reservoir here in the reconstruction as well to reflect some of the excavations of Hittite cities that show that an artificial cave housing a spring pool with steps leading down to it have been uncovered. That would have been used by the inhabitants of the city to gather their fresh water for drinking and washing. So I wanted to reflect that here in this build as well. So the last building I'm going to recreate here in the Minecraft Hittite city we're building is a Hittite storage structure. Just like in Minecraft, where every base has to have a storage system, so too is the case for Hittite cities. Excavations have uncovered large quantities of pulses, or in other words, legumes or beans or chickpeas, as well as oil and wine, which were stored in huge clay jars, some of which could be upwards of 2,000 liters or around 750 gallons of liquid. One of the other things that they would store in bulk is grain. I'm popping up on screen here a picture of one of the grain storage structures in Hadasha. This one had 32 rooms and was a storage complex that was 118 meters in length and dates to the 16th century BC. This granary would have stored an estimated 7,000 to 9,000 cubic meters of grain, which would have fed about 20 to 30,000 people per year. My storage system's clearly a bit smaller than that, but I tried to give an example of what the shape looked like and the rectangular storage sections. Likely, the different sections help compartmentalize and thus minimize spoilage issues. Beyond the size, my storage is also a little bit different than the one at Hadasha, as the one in real life was an underground complex. But I built mine on top of the ground, like the other buildings, to help show the compartmentalized sections a bit easier, but also because, if you maybe remember from part 1 of this video when I was terraforming this area and building the city walls, this area, if built underground here, would be underwater. So I didn't want to go through all the work of filling in the water as opposed to just covering it all up. So that's why the building's on top of the ground here. One of the interesting things, though, that Hittites did with their granaries to help their grain store for longer is that they would make their underground grain silos airtight. They would fill them with the grain and then seal them with clay to keep any air from penetrating. Then, as the grain fermented and then sprouted a bit, it would absorb any remaining air and replace it with carbon dioxide, and thus make a naturally toxic environment for rodents or bacteria which don't thrive in carbon dioxide-rich air. Well, I think that's about it. I really hope you enjoyed this two-part romp through building a Hittite city from the Bronze Age in Minecraft. If you haven't watched part 1, I hope you go and do that. I tried to keep these two videos as independent as possible so you wouldn't have to watch part 1 to make sense of part 2. But if you've made it this far in this part 2 video and haven't watched part 1, my guess is you're probably going to like that video as well. I put a bunch of links to articles I used in this episode, so please check those out if you want to learn more. Please take the time to like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. And if you want to see more videos about builds from the Bronze Age, please check those out here from my channel. Thanks, have a good rest of your day. Bye for now.